Hey everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Leap. I have one of my favorite people in my life returning. A little bit different this time, but you guys may remember Ann Moss Rogers when we had her on before, when she was talking about suicide prevention. But for those of you who do not know Ann, let me just tell you a little bit about her before we begin our interview. She is a renowned mental health professional speaker now on suicide prevention. And her motivation behind what she does after she lost her own beautiful son, Charles, to suicide in 2015. Her motivation is to help people find hope, healing, and purpose, to prevent suicide, to reduce substance misuse, and find life after loss. She is the author of 2 books. One is her award-winning memoir titled Diary of a Broken Mind, and her second book, Emotionally Naked, A Teacher's Guide to Preventing Suicide and Recognizing Students at Risk, has been out for, when was that published in?
Oh my gosh, 2021.
In when we were dealing with the pandemic. And that book has now made it into the hands of numerous schools around the country. So it is always such a deep honor to talk to you, Ann, and thank you for being here. Today, you're in here in a little bit of a different capacity. I'm asking you to share your very honest and raw story about your son and just the incredible transformations that have happened to you as a result of this deep loss and what you've done to carry his voice forward in this world and impact hundreds and thousands of lives. So thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's such an honor. And I always love to be with you, Susan.
I know it always feels like a treat, and you're getting busier and busier. So I am going to just hand the mic over to you to talk to us about your story and Charles' story, your gorgeous little son who's right behind you.
Yeah.
Your smile always makes me smile.
So Charles was always the funniest and most popular kid in the school, and no one could make me laugh like he could. And he was a creative genius, so he had all the little quirks, personality quirks that went with that. And he would always ask questions like, "Hey, Mom, if you're over a cliff and you're holding up me and Richard, and you're holding me in one hand and Richard in the other, and you realize that to save one of us, you have to let one of us go, which one would you let go?" And he just, questions that you could never answer as a mother. Oh, well, I would definitely. So I remember him pushing, and I remember, "Charles, of course I'd choose you." And then he went and told Richard, and Richard asked me, I'm like, "Well, Richard, of course I'd choose you." So I learned to play that game because he would just relentlessly say, "You got to answer, you got to answer it." So I learned to just answer what he wanted to hear. And if he told his brother, I'd say, no, that's not true at all. I'd pick you." So that was Charles. Always deep philosophical what if questions. And that would that would inspire critical thinking. The trouble was that he struggled with depression. We didn't know it for a very long time. And he also struggled with thoughts of suicide. And drugs and alcohol were his antidote to numbing that pain. So he'd be up late at night, we would be asleep, and he'd be struggling. And he thought, well, drugs might be bad, but it's better than killing myself. And in the moment, I can see where he would think, well, gosh, this works. But of course it works, and then it doesn't work. And I could see that it was making things worse. And he did try the traditional mental health system, but you know how well that's put together. And they humiliated me and him in that process. It was always, they were calling him an addict, and they would refuse to treat him because he was doing drugs. Couldn't he stop that? And then they would be able to treat him. So it's like they were holding him hostage because of the drug use.
And what was going on for you as a mother? You and I, of course, have had such in-depth conversations, and in your memoir, so beautifully written and really captures the hell that you went through, you and your husband as parents, trying to get Charles the help that he needed. So talk to us a little bit about What was happening for you, that desperation that was going on for you as a mother, and knowing that your son needed something and trying to get him the help that he needed, and it just felt like this exercise in pure futility? So can you speak a little bit about that?
Yeah, nothing makes you feel so helpless as to watch somebody that you love more than your own life really spiral. And you feel like you know what the answers are, but you can't make somebody else do what you want, you know. And I would find out how quickly I really didn't have control over this. And I do wish that I had hold some of the resources that I now share with other parents now, like CRAFT, CRAFT, for basically creating a family environment that makes it more conducive that somebody would go into recovery. Because at first, what I tended to do was kind of yell and shout. That didn't last very long because I realized how utterly unhelpful that is and how that really ultimately drives the person to do more substances, because guess what? That's how they manage problems, and that's how they cope. And I remember one specific day curling up in bed and crying and just praying for him to stop using drugs. And then I was like, you know what? This is like praying for a pony. This is ridiculous. I need to pray for the strength to figure out what to do next. And I thought I need to find a support group. What was weird is we were going to see a counselor, and I was asking a lot of mental health professionals, is there a group? There were several groups. They never ever said, try a NAMI, family support group, try Families Anonymous. You know, there's several groups that support families. And there was one locally called the Family Education Group that is amazing. And nobody ever mentioned that either. I ended up finding a group at the point where we had kind of used all the local resources, and we had to make the decision to kidnap our son out of his bed and have him escorted to a wilderness program. You don't do that because you caught your kid with a beer and a joint. You do that because you think your child's life is truly at risk. So I was watching a webinar from that particular wilderness camp. They had a great library of videos, and I was watching them, and one of them said something about Families Anonymous. And I'm like, well, what's that called? And I looked it up. There was a chapter in Richmond. I looked up at my husband. He says, oh, we're so going there. And we were there very next time they had it. And that's when I started to recognize that I only have so much control over this situation, that I needed to live for me, and that I needed to figure out a way to talk with my loved one that wasn't accusatory, that was more empathetic and loving, and that he wasn't doing drugs to hurt us. He was doing drugs to cover up pain or to fit in or to self-medicate. And I think for Charles, it was kind of all the above. And that I needed to be more empathic about, you know, what that was. That helped tremendously, is to find your people. And it's usually one of the things I tell parents, parents who've lost a child, parents who are still living with a child with either addiction, mental illness, or both. You got to find your people. Being isolated, holed up in your room, the walls are just going to close in, and you're really not going to make your best decisions that way.
And also, I think, you know, when we are sort of entrenched or immersed, I should say is a much better word, immersed in fear, just this incredible paralyzing fear, it does just that, right? It not only brings on a sense of profound loneliness, but it can be paralyzing. You don't know what step to take next. So you talked about this wilderness and kidnapping your kid. Can you talk to us?
Yeah. So what was odd is that I kept asking for a diagnosis. I didn't know the phrase psychological evaluation. And I remember asking the counselor my husband and I were seeing to figure out what to do with our son through this whole process. And I remember saying a teacher of his said she thought he might be depressed. And he wrote it off immediately, like, depressed people always ask for help. Charles is not depressed. And I remember thinking, well, you talked to the psychiatrist about him being on an SSRI. Why would you say that if you didn't think he was depressed? It was strange. And I remember it was the end of the hour and he stood up and we were done. So didn't even get to really fully explore that question. So he goes to Wilderness, and that's where we get a psychological evaluation. And they immediately say that he suffers from depression, anxiety, delayed sleep phase syndrome, what we already knew about. That wasn't on that evaluation, but that is a rare sleep disorder. And it meant that he couldn't fall asleep before 2 a.m. And of course, lack of sleep played into all of his other issues. And they also had on that form cannabis dependence, which meant that he was using, marijuana to manage his pain. And I think it also triggered some psychosis in him because, marijuana is not harmless. I mean, we think of it as harmless, but really long-term daily use of marijuana can trigger schizophrenia and can drive somebody towards suicide. Now, Charles kind of abandoned marijuana for harder drugs or different drugs. He was kind of a polysubstance abuser and would gradually get to heroin. But in Wilderness, he was protected from all that. And he actually did grow to appreciate it, even if he was angry that we put him there. But that's where he started writing music prolifically. And I think now, should I have done that or should I have not done that? But by taking that step, I think he would have died earlier had we not taken that step. And I do believe we've gotten some gifts that we wouldn't have otherwise gotten had we not taken that step. So that's kind of how I resolved it in my mind. So he started to write down his rap lyrics, which if you read them, kind of read a lot like poetry. And I didn't see any of the lyrics until after he died, but boy, are they very telling. And not many people capture how all of what he was going through feels. And he did such a great job of that. So it was such a gift after his death to understand how he felt. And then I also understood how much of his music had really captured some universal themes. And that's quite a gift.
So powerful. And I know his lyrics literally run through your memoir. And we're going to have you read some of those lyrics at the end of our conversation today, because, well, obviously I've read your book a couple of times, and he is such a gifted musician. I mean, I've watched his videos, I've read his lyrics, and you noted this earlier that he had a gift. And I think that what is so profound about his lyrics is he really gave you an inside look at what he was going through and how tortured he was by his mental health challenges. Well, like, as you said, that led to his drug use to numb those emotions. And I know through our conversations that you and your husband exhausted all of the resources available to you to help your son. So bring us further along down that path. At this point, he's gone to the wilderness camp. You and he've seen counselors. You and your husband have jumped through all of these hoops. Financially took a toll on you, right? Because we know how expensive the land of mental health is. And a lot of these things that you did with your son are not covered by insurance.
No, they're not.
So continue down the story with Charles and his mental health decline and what happened.
So from here, now you're talking about a kid who, up until now, roughing it meant going without the whipped cream on his Starbucks iced coffee. He was not like, oh, let me go out in the woods and hunt and fish. So he got through Wilderness and he thinks he's coming home. They had recommended that he go to a therapeutic boarding school, an even more expensive step, which, we didn't have a boarding school bank account. Fortunately, our home equity loan did, and that was the next step. And then he would eventually graduate. He would come home around in 2014, having spent maybe 22 months outside our home in some kind of placement. Not plan A. I mean, we were definitely emptied out all investments. It was a real time of struggle, both financially and emotionally. Still wasn't feeling like I was getting a whole heck of a lot of support, but the support group helped. What I didn't know is how quickly, when Charles came home, he got into heroin. Because when they start coping with their problems with a substance or with self-harm, it's really hard to break it. That it's so easy compared to meditating, and it's so much easier to just pop a pill or snort something. And he ends up addicted to heroin, and he probably lived in our house addicted to heroin almost 10 months, which that made me feel really stupid later. And then a friend of mine who is in recovery goes, that's nothing. I lived in my parents' house. I shut up for 10 years and they didn't know. Charles snorted it, so there wasn't any paraphernalia. So what he did is he would text his dealer. They would meet him in the driveway. He would be in his car. He'd do his drugs in the car. And then he would come back in the house. I mean, we had a rule, no drugs in the house. He was maintaining that rule. He was doing them in the car. So by the time I would see him, it'd be the next morning and he would wake up late. So a lot of the effects I didn't see. There were a couple of times things were kind of weird. He did his drugs while we slept. And 2 policemen came to the door one day and they showed pictures of Charles selling my family silverware. And that was when I realized, all right, something else is going on. And I sat him down to talk about it. And I'm really proud of this conversation. I didn't get angry. I just said, help me to understand why you would sell basically a 12-piece setting of my family silverware. And he makes up this big story. And he says, Mom, do you believe me? And I just said, that's some story. And then I shut up. So as parents, lots of times we want to kind of fill in the blank and we want to keep talking.
So you at no point believed his story. What was his story? Like short?
Oh God, it was me and this guy, and they tried to get us to sell drugs, but we said no, but I needed to pay him back because I bought something, then I was indebted, blah, blah, blah. I mean,
but you never believed the story. Okay.
No. And I just let it sit. I didn't accuse him of lying. I just said that's some story. And then I shut up.
Now, is this something that you learned? Because I'm imagining that there are parents out there right now, right? When it's such a terrifying thing when your children are into drugs and they're lying. I mean, is that something that you just learned through the resources, through talking to a therapist, or was it just more sort of the group? Okay.
Yeah. And I learned to listen more and lecture less. And let me tell you, you leave some of those stretches of silence where you're not saying anything and you're listening more, you will get more back. You will learn far more if you just shut up than if you keep talking and keep giving advice and keep lecturing. Because when has lecture ever worked? Like never, ever in the history of parenthood.
Never. And it doesn't work as adults either when anyone tries to lecture to us, right? First thing you do is you start tuning out the lecturer.
Or you dig your heels in.
Right. Exactly.
It's the last thing you want to do. Nobody wants to be told what to do. And by shutting up, it was the most ingenious move that I ever made. And then he starts kind of scrambling to fill in the blanks because he wasn't used to that. So he kind of starts to talk. And then finally he goes, I think I may be addicted to an opiate. And I remember us hugging and his nose kept running. So I didn't realize that was an indication that he was snorting heroin. And he only said opiate. He said, oh, I'm taking oxycodone. But he was closer to the truth than he had ever been. And he was asking for help. So I wasn't going to get all tangled in details.
Because they're irrelevant.
Irrelevant.
The drug is
Yeah.
irrelevant, and oxycodone, it probably sounded a lot better to him than telling you heroin,
Yeah.
because once you get to heroin, that is scary, but it's all scary,
Yeah.
right? The painkillers and the epidemic with people being addicted to painkillers is just as frightening, but it probably sounded lesser so to him, but it didn't matter. You got it. You're like, okay, we've got an issue. We've got a bigger issue going on now.
Right. And it just flipped the script so fast. And just think of how many times we'd be, okay, this is the direction we're going to go. We had to do like a 180 in the opposite direction because some crisis or some new development. And I always felt jerked in a different direction. And that was really hard to get used to. But with each incident, I built more resilience myself, and I was able to pick up myself faster, dust myself off, and figure out a direction in which to go. So he ends up going down to his grandparents so we can figure out what the next step is, which is about the stupidest thing on earth, because guess what? He goes into withdrawal down there. And for some reason, he had told me that he had been weaned off of it. I didn't know if it was true or not, but they offered, and I was still kind of, I was crazed. And we sent him down there, and he goes into withdrawal down there with his grandparents. They have no idea what to do. Long story short, he ends up in detox in Atlanta. Then he goes to rehab. He goes to a recovery house from there, and he relapses. It was their protocol to take him back to detox, so he would do 3 days there. He'd just done one hit, and he was readmitted back in there, and he walked out with a friend, and for 2 weeks we didn't know where they were. And then the next thing you know, I'm sitting in the back of a police car in the parking lot. My husband and I had gone out to dinner. The police had called. They met us in a parking lot, and that's where they told me that they had found my son dead that morning. And air left my lungs, siphoned out of my lungs. They forgot how to breathe. My ears filled with noise and screaming, yelling, and wailing. Sounds I didn't even think were possible to make. And about a minute into it, my husband says, well, how did he die? And I'm like, I didn't think he died. He was addicted to heroin. And then the officers said it was a suicide, and the method left no question. And that was like this extra twist of the knife. It was falling apart already, but that intention piece, it's like you feel like they're doing it to you, and that's not true. They're doing it to themselves because they feel worthless, because they feel like a burden, and they think you'll be better off without them. And just didn't understand why suicide. And it would be a really long time before I would, Susan. I mean, that took years of work, but it was so worth it. It really was. And that's why I kind of dove headfirst into learning about suicide prevention. I'm obsessive by nature, and I no longer cared about the digital marketing business that I owned. So I sold it to work free. I don't work free anymore, but for the first 2 years, I did. You remember, because you'd say, you're doing all this and I get paid for it. And I did work for a youth mental health organization part-time for about 18 months. And, that helped provide some income, but the universe just pushed me in that direction. And I've never looked back, and I've never regretted it.
Well, and as I said to you, I think that what moves me every time I listen to you speak or talk to you, it's what you've done with this incredible darkness that really could have swallowed you whole, and did it first, right? After the death of your son, and how you were able to take this child's life and his experience and use it to save other people's lives for real. And I want you to talk about Emotionally Naked and what you've done to set up that search engine when somebody is thinking about taking their life, because we all know you can find everything on Google on how to do various things to end your life, and it comes to your landing page. But before we go there, I want to back up to this moment when you learn of your son's death, you assume, of course, that he had overdosed, because why wouldn't you? And you find out that it's suicide, which just blindsided you in this other whole horrific, tragic way. What I've grown to learn through my own work, when people choose to take their life, it's exactly the things that you talked about, that everyone's going to be better off without me because I'm causing all of this pain. And also, when you are gripped by a deep addiction, sometimes taking your life seems the only way out of that hell, because that brings on just another whole different level of hell. When you've got an addiction that takes over even the pain that you had when you were dealing with your mental health issues. And so I would love for you to bring us to that moment when you decided that you were going to do something from this tragedy, because people can make lots of different decisions along the grief journey. Some people can get very stuck in anger. Sometimes their own mental health issues can take over. What happened? What was it? Do you remember what was the switch where you decided you were going to sell your company and you were going to use this life experience to really help impact the field of mental health and human beings struggling with what Charles struggled with?
It was actually, I felt like being pushed in that direction even the night we found out he died. I remember coming home, then we're collapsed on the floor, the dogs jumped in the middle, and I remember thinking, I can't survive this. And all of a sudden I thought, I can and I will, and I don't know what it looks like and I don't know what it feels like, but other people have done this and I'm going to do it too. And then I said to myself, as bad as it is right now, and Susan, it was brutal, it will never be that bad again. That part is over, and therefore it'll never hurt that much again. And I can survive these other grief episodes, because it kind of comes in waves. And then I found out that the really intense emotions that you struggle with, no matter what it is, anger, sadness, winning the lottery, intense emotions last 60 to 90 seconds. And to make sure that I sat with and felt those emotions, that I didn't push them away, I didn't numb them, that I recognized them, but I also didn't want to get stuck there. So one of the things I decided was, I'm going to set some parameters around this. And so the coulda, woulda, shouldas are a real struggle with suicide. And for me, so I would get up and I would torture myself on and off all day. And finally, I'm like, all right, enough of this. I'm going to allow myself 5 minutes of torture per day, where it's all my fault, and I'm going to go down that and coulda, woulda, shoulda, and we'll look at the text message and all the things I've failed to do. And I had 5 minutes to do that. And then the timer would go off. And if I did it again later that day, I would start to torture myself. I go, no, you've already tortured yourself today. You're done for the day. But tomorrow is a new day, and you can torture yourself for a whole 5 more minutes. And, you can blame yourself for everything in the world. But right now, you're going to distract yourself. And so I kind of learned the rhythm of my grief, and I gave myself permission to torture myself once a day, and then it would be 4 minutes, and then 3 minutes. And then somewhere in my head, I said, one day I'll forgive myself. And I woke up one day, it was almost at a year, and I said, oh my gosh, today I'm going to forgive myself today. I have no idea what it was about that particular day, but that was the day. And I wrote a blog post. That's the hardest one I've ever written. And that was when I pulled back the lens and recognized that there was a lot of manipulation going on, because that is typical of substance use disorder. And that I needed to recognize that it put my own brain in turmoil, and that I was too busy focusing on the 5% of parenting that I didn't do perfectly, ignoring the 95% that I did really well. I mean, Charles grew up in a house of love, and those little videos from the 90s showed that. And I needed to focus more on the memories, but that takes a while to get there. You're not going to get there week second. But I think the big thing is telling yourself that you will one day forgive yourself. Is just setting that intention that it's going to happen. Because if you set the intention of, I will never forgive myself, that's going to become a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I didn't set a date. I just figured it would happen when it happened. And that's exactly what happened. So I opened the door to allow that to happen.
I think one of the most profound things I've ever heard you say, and I don't know why, I don't feel like I've heard you say this before. Maybe you have, and I've missed it. I have so many thoughts in my head, but when you talked about giving yourself 5 minutes to torture yourself, first of all, I'm thinking, God, how horrible that sounds. And there's an and here, because that is what we do. We torture ourselves after we, even if it isn't a suicide in a child. I tortured myself after my brother's death. It's all through my book, all the things, the guilt. And I love two things about what you're saying, why they are so life-changing and profound, and why my body is actually encased in chills right now. One, you gave yourself full-on permission. You knew that no matter what self-talk you did, you were going to torture yourself. You were going to feel the feels of how you let your son down. You were going to. So you put a time limit on it, which is probably one of the most powerful things, I think, one of the most powerful things I've ever heard, because you didn't deny yourself that humanness, that egoic mind telling you that this was your fault. You put a time limit on it. And the third thing you did, you allowed your humanness, you allowed your grief process, and you allowed the room for forgiveness at some point. You didn't know when, you didn't know how long it would be. Right. It would have been 10 years.
Could have been.
But I have to even sit with this because it's really hitting me in a pretty profound way around what that means to give yourself the time to feel those dark emotions that can literally feel like they're swallowing us whole.
And it did. That's exactly how it felt, Susan. It did. It took me to my knees. And then some of those moments, it was like I hurt so much because I loved so much.
Yes.
And later on, I would recognize those moments of grief and I would cuddle up with them because I recognized that grief wasn't the big, bad, ugly wolf that I thought it was, but it was really the tie I had to my loved one. It was the thing that reminded me that he lived.
Yeah.
So at first it was so painful. And then it became this beautiful tie. And that transformation just takes a while to get there. And I've discovered that through writing. You and I both like to write. And that helped me work through a lot of those difficult emotions, anger, bitterness, and relief. I mean, our lives were such chaos before his death. So there was a moment of relief. And then I felt guilty about that. So you've got to acknowledge, you have to feel your feelings, but you also can't wallow. So finding that balance of feeling the feelings, letting them lift, and then distracting yourself. So I put a time limit on it, and I was telling somebody else, and she said what worked for her after we talked was she said, I can do it 3 times a day. She would do it quickly. And she said, so she gave herself a number of times. And once she had the third one, it's like, nope, you can do 3 more tomorrow. So it just depends on who you are and what works for you. But I just wrapped all these strategies around everything. And part of that was having been through a brain tumor, having been attacked, at knife point, barely escaped rape and murder. So I've worked through a lot of really difficult traumas in the past. And that had helped me build my toolbox. So I already had some of these tools available to me, and I just needed to expand that toolbox. And I knew that drinking and drugging wasn't going to help, because it certainly didn't help Charles and I watch that process.
I'm sure that our listeners are trying to take a collective breath as well, because you sort of skated over something that is pretty profound that happened to you in your life as you've been, you've built up this toolbox, and you had mentioned, that you were almost murdered. And I feel like I need to go back there because that's a pretty big thing that most of us don't deal
Yeah.
with in our life. And that is a huge trauma. And you have talked to me about this in the past, but I feel like we need to give more context to that experience in your life and what you learned from that helped you when you lost your son. Does that make sense to you, Anne?
It does.
Okay.
It does. So I was 18 and I was at the JC Haunted House, which was a group. And, they were just a men's club and they did great things for the community. And apparently this guy infiltrated for that night and got one of their t-shirts and started to pose like them and came up to me while I was in the haunted house and asked if I would exit through a different door because we were going to scare some of the people as they came out the house, and would I help with that? And my friends were kind of egging me to go do that. And I was like, I felt a little unsure about it. And, I'm like, oh, come on, you need to go do this. And as soon as I walked out, I'm like, oh my gosh, it's a mistake. And the chills and the hair on the back of my neck stood up. He hadn't even done anything at that point, but I was immediately on alert and looking for a way to escape. And then I felt a knife on my neck. And he said, you're going to do what I say. And so I decided at first I was going to submit. And then as he was taking off articles of clothing, I made the decision that no, I really don't want to submit after all. So I pretended that I fainted, and that got him all riled up, and he started to strangle me. So that did mean one good thing. He didn't have the knife in his hand, but another thing was I had to get these hands from around my neck, so because I couldn't breathe. And I'm not real sure how I managed to do that, but I did because I can't really remember that part. But when we were fighting, I started to scream, I'm being raped. And I remembered that from a show that I had seen 2 weeks prior called The Phil Donahue Show. And a lot of your listeners probably don't even remember the show. I've just dated myself. And there was a woman who was a guest on the show that basically gave you instructions if you decided to submit and gave you instructions if you decided to fight back. And I remembered those instructions. And one was to, if you're going to scream out something very specific. I'm being raped. And that's what I did. And someone called 911. And I was beaten. And I remember he took a bird bath and aimed it towards my head. And I rolled right at the right time. And it missed. And then he was standing above me, and I thought, oh my God, I'm a goner now. And I had just the perfect shot with my foot, and I jammed my foot between his legs, and that did it. I mean, he just doubled over because I hit him where it counted, and he limped away. And then I got up and I jumped over this fence. It's like a 12-foot fence, and it has barbed wire at the top. I have no idea how I got over this fence, but you do things in the moment. And then when I went, the police were out front and they were very dismissive. They treated me like I was lying, said I had no skin under my fingernails. This didn't happen to me. It was just a fight with a boyfriend. And I could hear him talking about me in the background. And I remember being really angry, but they were policemen, so what could I do? And they drove me home. And I told my father and mother what happened. My dad was furious. He was so angry. He called the chief of police that night, demanded that the chief of police, and my dad grew up in this town. His father had been mayor of the town. So, he was pretty well known, not famous, but people knew who he was. And the chief of police came the next day and formally apologized because by that time I had the red marks around my throat where I'd been strangled that were there for a couple of weeks. I could barely walk. I had bruises all over me. I looked pretty messed up. Blood still, coming from certain parts of my head. And I had told them that I lost a dollar bill, an earring, and there was this huge blanket. But I felt like the cops had never gone to the area where I told them to go. And we walked back there, and everything was there just as I had told him. And I said, you see, the officers never came back here because they didn't believe me. And he said, accept my profound apology. And I said, thank you, I will accept that.
So you said that you had built up this toolbox because you had been through all of these different things in your life, brain tumor and this horrific attack. Tell us about that. What happened from that experience that helped you cope with the death of your son?
Fight back, that you can come back from anything, and that it's not always easy, but it can be done. I'm just not going to let somebody take away something that's important to me like that. So, had he been able to rape me, it was a sexual assault, pretty bad one, but there was no penetration. And I decided no matter what, that I was gonna figure out a way forward, that I wasn't gonna let that define me. And by making that decision, when it came to the brain tumor, I had that same, I can't really explain what it is, but I remember crying and finding out about the brain tumor. I'm in the car and I'm making this scenario up in my head. I'm getting all drama queen about it, like I'm gonna die and blah, blah, blah. And then I was like, oh, for God's sake, Aunt Moss, cut it out. You just need to do what you need to do. And you're not gonna die. And you need to face it. And you need to figure out how to face it. And you know you can do it. So it is that positive self-talk, and I actually started that when I was 15, where I didn't allow myself to criticize. So I would criticize, but I had to have kind of an alter ego conversation where it ended on a positive note, where there was understanding and talking about the fears. So there had to be kind of a exploration and reflection. So that was my way of kind of reflecting on things. And I didn't realize actually until my son died by suicide that I had used this method for decades and that I had started at the age of 15. And isn't that funny? I never really even recognized that I used this kind of me and my alter ego having this debate until he died. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I've done this my whole life. And it is a coping strategy.
Well, I mean, I would take it even beyond a coping strategy. It is the incredible resilience of who you are as a human being, but also it is that mindset. It is, and I just was catapulted to what you said earlier about I can torture myself for 5 minutes and then that needs to stop. And all of a sudden, when you were talking about being a 15-year-old, you did the same thing. You would allow yourself to have these conversations with yourself and maybe beat yourself up or do the negative self-talk that we all do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yet you would have to end it on a positive note. And these were stepping stones on your path that would bring you and get you through these incredible life challenges. That this is the way I'm thinking through it, that built up your resiliency to this point where you were able to survive your son's suicide, and not only survive it, but do some incredibly powerful work as a result. I just want people to soak in the power behind what we're talking about, that we are always so much stronger than we even begin to understand. But look at the stepping stones that helped you deal with an unimaginable tragedy. I find that incredible.
There was a young lady in our support group. She lost her brother to suicide and her mother to suicide. When her mother died, she was left to care for her sister who lives with autism. And we were talking one night in group, and she just looked up and I was like, what have you realized about yourself for this tragedy? And she said that I'm a lot stronger than I ever thought. that I could. And that just made me cry. I thought, wow, she's 24 years old and she's not bitter, but she just realizes I was stronger than I ever knew that I was. And we have those resources within us, and you just have to believe that you do. And I think that's so important to start thinking about that. And another thing is, there are people out there that will criticize. You should not be one of them. You should never join in that chorus. Most people don't do that. There may be somebody who does, but I'm not going to be one of them. I'm not going to be the person that brings me down. I'll let somebody else do that. But it's important that we fight for ourselves. It's important that we fight for our own mental health.
Amen to that. I usually save my self-love question for last, but we're going to close today with Charles' lyrics. So I want to ask you, because I think this is a nice segue into the question around self-love. How do you practice self-love? And I always say as a result of the death, because I know that your life has changed in every imaginable way since Charles' death. What does self-love look like for you?
So I have several strategies, but I'm just going to tell you about one. So I'm a speaker and I go all over the country, speak on suicide prevention, postvention, grief. And what I was finding is that I would be excited before, I loved being up there, but afterwards I felt really low and empty. And so I devised a plan for that. And I asked people if at the end of the presentation, if they could write on an index card one thing that they learned or one takeaway. And sometimes they put two, and sometimes they write a note. And I tell people in the audience, I'm doing it for selfish reasons. I feel low at the end of these, I guess, because I've told my story and then I'm all alone after I leave. And it's a way for me to take a piece of you with me. And it's just a really generous gift. And I would really appreciate it. And then they start writing, and it's like I savor it and hold it like, okay, you can drive home now.
Okay, sorry about that, guys. We have bad thunderstorms here and we just lost Anne for a few moments. So if this sounds a little choppy, that is why she had to jump on a different computer. So the lighting is a little different. What you were saying is that you have the audience write you these notes, you get these notes, and you said you savor them.
I do. And it fills up that space that was empty after I speak. And that is a self-care step for me. I think it's a win-win for my audience because they get to share, sometimes they'll leave one thing they've learned, sometimes it's several, sometimes on the back they'll leave a nice note, or they'll tell me about someone they lost or some struggle they've had. So it is like I'm taking a piece, and I keep every one of them. So it fills up a whole basket now that I've done this so many times.
I think that that is a beautiful way to think about taking care of yourself, because what you've done is honor the way you feel after one of these large talks. And it takes a tremendous amount of energy, and you are giving a tremendous amount out there to everybody that is listening. And that self-care is recognizing what you need and asking for it. And so I think that is self-care, no matter where that plays out, is recognizing how we feel, honoring it, and asking for what we need. So thank you for that. Okay.
You're welcome.
What we've all been waiting for, at least me, and I know this is not going to be an easy thing for you, but these are lyrics from Charles from one of his songs.
This is actually an edited down version for a couple of reasons. One, for time, and two, because it's easier to read a minute and a half than it is like 4 minutes. The name of the song is Forgive Me, Mama. I just want to apologize for all my lies and all the times you stayed up at night traumatized. From when I said I want to die, when we argued, screamed, and cried. I used to wonder if it was possible for a soul to bleed inside. I was trapped in the dark, but I see the light. Your love would never budge, even when I would scream, cuss, puke, and get drunk. I wasn't raised that way. I know it cut like razor blades. Forgive me, Mama. I tried the fast lane and got addicted, Mama. My actions were ugly, teenage druggy, looking for anything to numb me, pathetic, scummy. I was still your little kid inside, the same little boy who said, Mama, I lost my tooth, was the same kid saying, I need bail from you. I failed you. You're my mom, the only one I'll ever have. I'm sorry I was bad, all the tears I could sit in a bath. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm sorry, Dad. When everything leaves, all you have is hope. All you have is family. I took that for granted, and I can't stand it. I did it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
You. Thank you for everything you do, everything you're doing, who you are. You know how I feel about you. I think you are such a remarkable human. And we'll have all the ways people can get a hold of you through your blog and your website and links to your books. And I don't know, I just want you to know how much I love and appreciate you.
Same here. You know, I think we got a mutual admiration society. Thank you so much for having me and sharing me with your listeners.
Thank you. Have a wonderful night. And thank all of you for listening. I love you guys. And I will see you all here next week. Bye for now. Thank you so much for tuning in and listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Leap, please subscribe, share it with others, or leave a rating and review so others can benefit from this content. Be sure to check out the show notes for resources related to this episode. And to catch all the latest from me, you can follow me on Instagram at susan.casey. If you have a transformational story to share on grief and loss, please email me at leapwithsusan@gmail.com. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.